The last U.S. president to receive a state funeral service was Lyndon Johnson. This is footage of his funeral services in the Capitol Rotunda from January 1973. It's a half hour. After this, we'll show you President Johnson's funeral service at the National City Christian Church in Washington, D.C.
Mr. President, Mrs. Johnson and family, my colleagues, and my fellow Americans. Lyndon Baines Johnson was a president for the people. Working for the people came easily and naturally to his presidency. It was the fulfillment of a career as Texas National Youth Administrator, Congressman, Senator, and Vice President. When I was elected in 1963 to the 10th Congressional District seat of Texas that Lyndon Johnson filled in 1937, I sought his advice. He gave me one guiding principle, then and always later. He said, Congressman, when you vote, vote for the people. This was the same principle that guided Lyndon Johnson's public life. Wherever he served, we were struck by the bigness of this man. His energy, his drive, his ambition, his quest for perfection in all he did and in all he asked us to do. His demand for the best within us was relentless. He persuaded, he cajoled, and he drove us until we fulfilled potentials we never knew we had. And when we did our best, he wrapped his long arms around us, for he loved us, and he wanted us to do our best and to see our country at its best. To those of us who were closest to him from the start, we understood him, for we were his boys. He meant to us what the great Sam Rayburn meant to him, and what Franklin Roosevelt meant to both of them. We could sense even then the reach for greatness deep within this man. We were joined by dozens, then hundreds of young men and women that Lyndon Johnson gathered around him over the course of his public life, not simply to serve him, but to help him achieve his vision of America. His ambition for himself was as nothing compared to his ambition for America. As hard as he drove America towards this vision and asked us to work for a great society, he gave more of himself to that goal than he ever asked of any of us. As a young man, he experienced poverty and witnessed discrimination. He learned firsthand about drought and parched earth, about stomachs that weren't full and sores that weren't healed. He brought water and electricity and housing to the congressional district he served. As a congressman, he knew what it was like to be a poor farmer, a working man without a job, a black, a Mexican American. And he set about changing life for the disadvantaged among his constituents. As Senator and Vice President, he saw that it was just as difficult to be poor or unemployed or black or brown in the big cities of the Northeast and the West Coast as it was in Central America, Central Texas. He authored the first elementary and the secondary education act in our nation's history, and the Head Start program that bears Mrs. Johnson's influence. He did these things to give every American child the opportunity to go to school and develop his talents to the fullest. He saw the landscape ravaged by American technology, and he loved and he moved to clean our air and our water, to protect our land, and to turn the brilliance of that technology to the restoration of our natural environment. He knew well what that technology could do, for he guided our space program as Senator, Vice President, and President until America placed the first man on the moon. Lyndon Johnson was proudest of his achievements in the field of civil rights. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the granddaddy of them all, which opened public accommodations and jobs to all Americans regardless of color, and the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which gives every American regardless of his color the right to live in any house he can afford. By his own testimony, Lyndon Johnson's greatest achievement in civil rights was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. No second-class justice at home, no second-place status in the world for our ideals and benefits. Lyndon Johnson never lived in a gray twilight. He put it best himself when he said, "The old is not coming down. Rather, the troubling and torment of these days stem from the new trying to rise into place." His closest friend and his wisest advisor was his lovely wife. She inspired his concern for our environment. Most of all, Lady Bird Johnson understood her husband, and he understood her as few men and women dare hope to understand and love each other. It is no wonder that their daughters, Linda Bird and Lucy, brought so much credit to their family and to our country. For they came out of this beautiful bond and were privileged to share in this close and loving relationship. I want to be the president who helped to end the war among the brothers of this earth. And he did all of these things. Now, from his new vantage point, the president will rest in his beloved hill country, where he has told us his daddy before him said he too wanted to come home. Come home, where folks know when you're sick and they care when you die. 200 million Americans care, Mr. President. We care and we love you.
A home on the bank of the Pedernales in the beautiful hill country of Texas, surrounded by his beloved family and the friends with whom he so fully shared his warm and generous spirit. A home in this place where we are gathered today, in the Congress which was his life for so long, filled with friendships enlivened by that political debate which is the lifeblood of a free society, but friendships cemented by the common task of ensuring that the public business somehow go forward at the end of the day. A home for more than 5 years at the summit of responsibility and not necessarily of power. For he, as other presidents, understood that many expectations and demands were addressed to him which were beyond his constitutional reach, or indeed beyond the reach of our nation in a world community where we might persuade but cannot command. These were years of awesome burdens, but burdens lightened by the fine intelligence and the natural grace and the personal devotion of the First Lady, who was always at his side. And now he returns to the Pedernales, to a home among the immortals. That goodly company of men and women whom we shall forever cherish, because they were concerned about those matters which barred the path to our becoming what we have in us to become. More than 1,000 years ago, in a simpler and more robust age, perhaps we might have known him as Lyndon the Liberator, for he was determined to free our people in body, mind, and spirit. A few strokes of the brush cannot portray this man to whom we offer our affection and respect today. As for me, I would begin with his deep compassion for his fellow man, a compassion which was shared by the Congress and resulted in the most extraordinary legislative season in our history. Who can forget that remarkable evening of March 15, 1965, when President Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress on voting rights and other civil rights? It was perhaps his finest single message. You will remember that after recalling his days as a teacher of poor Mexican-American children back in 1928, he said, "It never even occurred to me in my fondest dreams that I might have the chance to help the sons and daughters of those students and to help people like them all over the country." And then, with eyes which bored into the conscience of all who heard him, he said, "But now I do have that chance, and I'll let you in on a secret. I mean to use it, and I hope you will use it with me." And then he went on to disclose in a very frank way what some of his deepest hopes were. And Congressman Pickle has already quoted those hopes. One may give these ideas any name or epithet one might choose. They did not evolve out of some empty intellectual exercise. They were not the product of shrewd political calculation. His colleagues knew them as a volcanic eruption from the innermost being of his soul, when the responsibility for leadership finally became his own. Many have said that Lyndon Johnson was demanding upon his colleagues and personal staff. Indeed, he was, and demanding upon the Congress and the American people and many a foreign leader as well. But he was most demanding upon himself and stubbornly resisted the admonitions of his associates to slow down. There was so much to do, and there was so little time in which to get it done. President Johnson sometimes deprecated his own background in foreign affairs. Actually, he brought great talents and a rich experience to this aspect of the presidency in November 1963. As Senate Majority Leader throughout much of the Eisenhower years, he was necessarily and deeply involved in the widest range of legislation affecting foreign and defense policy. When he became Vice President, President Kennedy asked him frequently to make foreign visits and consult with foreign leaders on matters of major importance, not merely a tourist visit. He absorbed briefings in a most expert fashion, and with a powerful intellect went directly to the heart of the issues under discussion. And as many present know, he was always formidable in negotiation or persuasion. He had a special ability, perhaps learned in the Senate, to begin his consideration of a problem by putting himself in the other fellow's shoes in an attempt to understand which answers might be possible. He had a personal code of relations among political leaders which did not permit him or his colleagues to engage in personal vilification aimed at foreign leaders. The historian will take a broader view and weigh such things as the consular and civil air agreements with the Soviet Union, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, our space treaties, his East-West trade bill, the beginnings of the SALT talks, and many other initiatives aimed at building the peace. He had a very special and affectionate feeling for the nations of the Western Hemisphere. He used to say to us, "This hemisphere is where we live. This is our home. These are our neighbors. We must start with our own neighborhood." Mr. President, last evening you made some moving remarks about President Johnson in your brief address to the American people. We congratulate you on the substance of that address and give you our best wishes for the weeks and months ahead. I mentioned 2 points which you made about Lyndon Johnson. That President Johnson was a man of peace and would have welcomed the peace which seems now to be opening up in Southeast Asia. How true. And he would indeed have joined you, Mr. President, in paying tribute to those millions of gallant and dedicated men in uniform whose service and sacrifice opened the way for the peace which is before us. In his last State of the Union message to the Congress, his final sentence was, "But I believe that at least it will be said that we tried." Ah, yes, he tried with reckless disregard for his own life. Men and women all over the earth are forever in his debt.
The church in which the state funeral for Mr. Johnson will shortly take place is the National City Christian Church. It's about 2 miles from the Capitol building. It's the church where Mr. Johnson attended his last service as president, a service in which he heard a prayer he had written for the occasion. The route of the motorcade from the Capitol is west along Constitution Avenue, then northwest on Pennsylvania Avenue to 14th Street, and finally north on 14th Street to the church at Thomas Circle, and that's at the convergence of Vermont and Massachusetts Avenue. This was President Johnson's favorite church. He felt particularly close to the minister of the church. The service there is expected to last no more than 40 minutes. We're now going to go to the church where Paul Duke is for the beginning of the services.
And, Barbara, the motorcade is now pulling up to the church. And President Nixon and Mrs. Nixon are arriving. The Nixon daughters and Edward Cox and President Nixon and Mrs. Nixon. The first family now walking up the steps into the church. Accompanied by the minister, Dr. George Davis. Mrs. Eisenhower sitting with the Nixon family. Flowers at the front of the church are remembrances from various government leaders and officials and old friends. The British government is represented, the Canadian government. There is also a wreath from Governor Wallace of Alabama. The organ meditation now includes some of the favorite hymns of President and Mrs. Johnson. And now inside the church is Lee McCarthy.
The church has been filling up since about 8:30 this morning. It's now about half full. Many of the members of the Johnson administration are here. We have seen from our vantage point, which is in the balcony, Robert McNamara, Nicholas Katzenbach, Lawrence O'Brien. Abe Fortas came in a little while ago. Also, Bobby Baker, one of the sad points in President Johnson's career, the scandal which surrounded Bobby Baker and eventually sent him to prison. Back out front, the church and Paul Duke.
And now the motorcade bearing the body of President Johnson begins to reach Thomas Circle, where the church is situated. Motorcade pulling into the circle around in front of the church. Mrs. Johnson greeting the minister. Her daughters and their family immediately behind her. Among others at the service today is former Japanese Premier Sato. Mayor Daley of Chicago arrived a short while ago. Coretta King, widow of Martin Luther King. Averil Harriman. Mayor Walter Washington of Washington, D.C. Bayard Rustin, civil rights leader. Emanuel Suller of New York, who served in Congress for 50 years and worked closely with Mr. Johnson on civil rights legislation. George McGovern and Mrs. McGovern are here. Along with numerous other senators and representatives, several governors. Outside the church, the Navy Honor Guard.
This concludes the Today program's special extended coverage of the final ceremonies and funeral services for former President Lyndon Johnson. NBC News will continue with its full coverage of the funeral, with David Brinkley commenting after this brief pause for station identification.
Lyndon Baines Johnson, a service of tribute. Here is NBC News correspondent David Brinkley.
It's 10 a.m. in Washington. As you have seen, the casket bearing the body of the late president is now being carried into the church, where the congregation and guests are in place, and the service is about to start.
gracious and compassionate Father, lover of the souls of men, often we have walked through the dusk to sunset. We have come here to celebrate sunrise. Often we have known the bitter taste of defeat. We come here to celebrate victory. Often we have looked into the dark eyes of death. We come here to celebrate life. Often we have walked to the mournful sound of muffled drums. We are grateful we may hear clear and exalting above all human sounds of earth the glorious trumpets of God. O God of sunrise and of life, God of trumpets and eternal victory, grant these moments together to be moments lifting us up to mountain peaks of spiritual transfiguration. O Thou who dost bring comfort and spiritual hope to man, thanks be to Thee, to whom we belong forever and forever.
Leontine Price, Metropolitan Opera.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn.
Let us hear the word of the Lord and what the Spirit says to the churches. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for God is with me. Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, Jesus said, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven. And God shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no night there. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me shall never die. Thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. May we pray. These words, O God, are thy words. This book from which we have read, written by men, is in a deeper sense from your hands, a gift of eternity to time. We read and hear and ponder it, for in so doing we know we were made not for the dust, but for everlasting life, that we are the children, the friends, and the co-workers of God. Yes, O Father, even as this book itself declares, we are but a little lower than God himself. And for this we are grateful in the Spirit of Christ. Will the congregation unite as you remain seated and singing the great hymn, one of President Johnson's favorites.
He was ours, and we loved him beyond any telling of it. He shared his victories, and he shared his defeats. In victory, he taught us to be magnanimous. In defeat, he taught us to be without hate, to learn, to rally, to accept the challenge, and to try again. He believed that good men together could accomplish anything, even the most impossible of dreams. No matter who his opponent, he constantly sought to find that touchstone within the soul of every man, which, if discovered, would release the impulse for honest and fair solution. Hate was never in this man's heart. Each of you has your own memories of this man who served for 37 years in this city. I had the honor of being with him through the final 4 years of his presidency. In those great moments of triumph, when the American people endorsed him so strongly, in those magnificent hours when he stood before the Congress of the United States and led the way to the passage of laws long overdue that would lead to justice long denied. And in that darkening twilight, when as a man seeking peace, he was forced to continue a bitter war to honor our country's commitment for a small, far-off ally. I watched the gray come into his hair. I saw each deep line etch itself into his face as he gave all at his command to lead our country through the turmoil which surged around us. I watched him as he used his great gift of persuasion to convince a Southern senator that the time had come for a civil rights law. I watched him formulate, secure passage, and sign into law the most comprehensive legislative program in education, housing, conservation, and health of any president in history. I watched him in the Situation Room at the time of crisis during the Six-Day War, when only his ability, his knowledge, and his sheer courage helped to keep that conflict from widening into a deeper confrontation. I sat with him those long nights as he endured the agony of Vietnam, and he sought the key to peace. And as he waited for word of men whom he had ordered into battle, each was a human being to him, not a statistic. Each was a name linked with wives and parents and children. He cared for people, not for numbers. So desperately did he want a just and lasting peace. So much did he want us to reason together. So much did he yearn that man's goodness would triumph over man's evil. So often, as friend turned to political foe, did he nod with sad understanding and pray that in the years to come, the sacrifices he was making would be worthy of the American people and serve ultimately as a firm platform on which to build a better America. And through it all, I saw him earnestly seek God's wisdom for his decisions. For this man had a strong belief in the Almighty. President Nixon, as you so eloquently stated in your message informing Congress of President Johnson's death, it was his noble and difficult destiny to lead America through a long, dark night of necessity at home and abroad. If he could have chosen other circumstances in which to be president, perhaps he would have. But America has a capacity to call forth the leadership it must have in those hours of its greatest need. We had Abraham Lincoln when he was needed. We had Franklin Roosevelt when he was needed. History will record that in the 7th decade of the 20th century, America had Lyndon Johnson when he was needed. When you remember him please for two things: his devotion to his country and his restraint. So often in his presidency, dissension escalated into violence, yet always, no matter how critical the situation, his inner faith in the people came to the fore, and his restraint in the uses of power permitted the people to confront each situation and overcome it, utilizing the inherent rights of free men. Those of us who loved him take comfort in the knowledge that before he died, he could see the dawn of domestic tranquility and of foreign peace, which he gave so much of his great heart to bring about. The structure of peace which President Nixon, with great distinction and determination, is building in the world today will rest upon a foundation laid by loneliness and stubborn courage of Lyndon Johnson. This man's restless, searching heart began to give out long before January the 22nd. He gave so much of himself to so many that it is wondrous that God, in his glory, granted him 4 years to enjoy his retirement in the hill country he so deeply treasured. Not for him the easy way, not for him the halfway measures. He was a tall man of giant character, and when he committed himself totally. And he asked his countrymen to do the same. He asked those who had much to be concerned for those who had least. He asked us to live up to our national promise. He asked us to be worthy of our heritage. He asked us to be true to ourselves. But he never asked more than he was willing to give. And what he gave was good enough to confirm and advance the progresses of the nation he served. Lyndon Johnson loved a woman. She was his greatest joy, and she was his greatest comfort. He loved his children, and he loved his grandchildren. And to see all of them together was a heartwarming experience, for it transcended normal family devotion. And coupled with that, he loved each of us, sometimes with wry amusement at our failures, often with sharp words at our imperfections, but always with a sweeping and generous understanding of our frailties. The dimensions of this man were vast. He is gone from us now, and this afternoon we shall take him home and he will be forever a part of the Hill Country. Last September, I had the opportunity to be with him. When he spoke of America and of the future, he knew then that he might not see another autumn. But this was not a man who welcomed or needed sympathy. Years from now, when historians appraise him, his speech that day could serve as the cornerstone of their research, for it reflected the true Lyndon Johnson. He gave much of himself to it, and it might well be his epitaph. He said, with the coming of September, each year we're reminded, as the song says, that the days are dwindling down to a precious few. The green leaves of summer will begin to brown. The chilly winds of winter will begin to blow. And before we're ready for the end to come, the year will be gone. As it is with the calendar, so it sometimes seems to be with our country and our system. For there are those among us who would have us believe that America has come to its own September, and that our nation's span as mankind's last best hope will be done. President Johnson continued, but I live by the faith that with each passing day, we're always approaching nearer to the beginning of a new springtime. And it is by that perspective that I see our country now. No nation can be more than the vision of its people. America cannot be more than we believe ourselves capable of becoming. I want to open the soul of America to the warm sunlight of faith in itself, faith in the principles and precepts of its birth, and faith in the promise and potential of its people. That was Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States of America. The years will be lonely without him.
I stand in a unique relationship in this pulpit, as I stood across the years in a unique relationship. I was not the political advisor of President Johnson. I have no expertise in this field. He never asked my opinion about what he should do in this policy or that. I was not his emissary. He never sent me on a mission to secure information or to share with him my insights into the international picture. Around him, as does President Nixon, there were men and women qualified in their fields. I was his minister and his friend. What more could a man ask? I was his minister in that he knew if he wanted my spiritual service, I was at his command, but he never asked me for anything at a time I was committed to something he felt would be an imposition upon me. I was his friend because he trusted me and knew that I would never, with friend or foe, betray him. But he was my minister and friend. You see, lay people are ministers too. I learned from him many lessons. I learned, first of all, how to deal with the pressures of life and how to live within this city, which drives men to insanity and to early graves. As President Truman so eloquently said, though in a strange way, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. From Lyndon Johnson, I learned that men can live within the heat and bear it. I learned what prayer means. From him, I was often in prayer with him, but never with a man in desperation grasping at a straw as if a ship were going down. He wanted prayer as if he were talking to the friend of the universe. And then I watched him wheel down corridors of hospitals to surgery, laughing with the nurses and the interns. For to him, religion was no phony business. Religion was life. And you could best work it out in your profession. And he felt, as I am sure President Nixon does, that in the political field and arena, there he could best express God's will for his life and his help to humankind. I was his minister and friend. He was my minister and friend. Briefly, I want to leave a text with you from the Old Testament, from a word God gave when Moses died. Now, Lyndon Johnson, and I never called him Lyndon, always President Johnson, would abhor being compared to any character in the Bible. He would consider this a vast presumption, for he was so human. That's what I liked about him, one of the things I liked about him. I think one of the things he liked about me was that he thought I wasn't a stuffed shirt, ecclesiastical leader. When Moses died, and there were likenesses, the hardness of discipline, great decisions, sitting on top of a volcano you didn't create, trying to control it. When Moses died, people began to wonder, what on earth are we to do? And God said to Joshua and to the people of Israel, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise. There is time for sorrow. I shall cry about this in private when I am alone and feel no shame, for I loved him with profound devotion. There is a time for mourning, but the word America needs today, the word Lyndon Johnson would speak today if he were speaking the word God says to us, I believe, Lyndon, my servant, is dead, now therefore arise. Arise, first of all, to memory, to the memory of his vast accomplishments. And you name the area he strove. He said, whether it was original with him, I don't know, but he said it isn't hard to do right, it's hard to know what is right to do. Let us arise and stand in exaltation to remember what this man did in his human way. For Moses was human. He was not even allowed to enter the promised land, but he was God's man. I think God uses men, not angels. Angels frighten me. God uses men on earth to do his will, human men with frailties and sins and weaknesses. Lyndon, my servant, is dead. Therefore arise to the great memory and heritage he's left. Let us arise to memory. Let us arise to rededication. The task is unfinished. Moses could not enter the promised land due to some fault of his own, some flaw in his nature. He could only stand and look into the promised land while Joshua led the people in. But he'd helped to build the road toward that promised land. Not all of us live to see our dreams accomplished. Why do we have to? Why can't we let the future accomplish some of them? Why can't we let our children and our grandchildren do something? Why do we have to worry ourselves to death believing we have to accomplish all the tasks and that we failed if somehow we didn't achieve all of our dreams? My father never did. My mother never did. Nobody ever did. Lyndon, my servant, is dead, therefore arise and be to the task. Lyndon, my servant, is dead, therefore the call to renewal, to a rebirth of faith, personal and deep and profound. The newspapers reported that President Johnson died alone. Oh, no. Oh, no. Not alone. No man ever dies alone. Men die lonely deaths in ghettos, on battlefields, in loneliness, but never alone. For they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. I plan to see President Johnson someday again. I do not know how in the mystery of God this will be accomplished. I don't even know how I got into this world. I don't understand how my grandchildren were born, how this miracle of human birth is achieved. I therefore do not understand what heaven is or where it is or how we get there. I believe deep within me I shall cross his path again and that he is alive. Lyndon Johnson is dead but alive. Therefore arise. To the age in which we live, committed to the tasks in which he believed and in which you believe. One of the most magnificent things he ever accomplished was in that great crisis following the assassination of President Kennedy, when he assumed the leadership and with his wonderful wife helped to hold this nation together. And never in all of our history has a more gracious exchange of power been made than between President Nixon and President Johnson. It will stand out through all the years of American history as one of the most gracious acts on the part of two men in the exchange of power and place. Arise, arise, onward, Christian soldiers. Following the benediction, will you remain standing, please? Grant us, O Father, to go from this sacred place where our dear friend and comrade so often prayed and worshiped, as he himself would have us go, looking into the tomorrows with bright hope and unafraid. Upon the gracious lady who has walked through the years by his side, blessing every life she touched. Upon their family and all friends, indeed, God, upon us all, send the comfort of thy Spirit. Help us to believe more in God, but help us also to believe more in man, in people. Grant us to trust our deepest faith and not our doubts. Oh God, thank you that our paths crossed the path of this man, Lyndon Johnson. We have no doubt at all, in your good time, our paths shall cross again. Let your blessing rest upon the now President of the United States, his gracious family, and those associated with him, as they lead this nation into the unknown and critical but exciting and thrilling days ahead. And we know from somewhere in the land of beginning again, Lyndon Johnson joins us in this prayer. And now may the love of God, the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, and the fellowship and communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all both now and forever.